going to talk about 5 of my favorite filters. I think 3 or 4 of which are pretty broad. They're filters that you can use on almost any kind of picture, and I find myself using them very often on landscape photography and then on all sorts of other kinds of photography as well. And then I just have one filter and then a recipe that I like to use that is a little bit more specific, and it's fun, and it might be one that you don't think to use all of the time, and I actually end up using it pretty often. That's actually the cross-processing filter. I just love that filter. It's very simple to use as well. Anyways, we're talking about Color Efex Pro. It's 55 creative filters, and then there are 20 recipes that are built into the software. We're gonna delineate the difference between what a filter is compared to a recipe. We're gonna kind of discuss the basic interface and how to use these filters, how to favorite them, how to favorite a recipe, customize your options that's in each individual filter. Every filter has its own set of sliders, and we're gonna kind of talk about an approach to utilizing those sliders. We'll use control points and global adjustments of the filters, and then we're gonna be combining multiple filters together, and then I'll show you how to save that as your own custom recipe. We're gonna actually build a recipe today of some filters a combination of filters that I end up using pretty often. So let's go ahead and jump right in. I'm gonna scroll over here. I've got to remember which image I wanted to use. I think I wanted to use this photo to begin with. This is in my mind, a pretty interesting looking photograph. I'm gonna sort of minimize the images down here in Photolab. By the way, I'm gonna show you how to launch the software from Photolab today, Photolab 3, and from Photoshop. If you're a Lightroom user, the way that it works is pretty similar to the way that it works within Photolab. And I can actually answer any questions you might have about that if you happen to be a Lightroom user. But because we've got so much to talk about, I'm not gonna try and get it to Lightroom, Photolab, and Photoshop. Anyways, this is a photograph that actually was shot with a tilt shift lens. Some folks in the webinar probably recognize that right off the bat. This was optically shot like in camera with a tilt shift lens, but this kind of effect is something that you can actually do within Perspective Effects, which is the newest piece of software from the Nik collection. It doesn't completely emulate what would happen in a lens, but it is really great for this sort of creative process. So anyways, let's go ahead and launch the image. It doesn't matter what the photograph is necessarily, because we're talking about Color Efex Pro, which we've sort of established as a collection of 55 individual filters. So to access the software from Photolab 3, you move into the lower right corner of the interface, and you just click the Nik collection button that you see down there. From there, your plugin selector is going to open, and in alphabetical order, each of the Nik plugins will be listed out there for you. We're going to click on Color Efex Pro. Actually, before I do that, I just want to make sure that the settings are set properly, because I go through and change them from time to time for different purposes. So I'm going to click on the settings button. It looks like everything's copacetic here. So what I'm looking for is that I'm going to be using a TIFF file. It's 16-bit. That's going to yield me the highest quality file possible here. And then I don't actually need to resize the image. So I'm going to click this little box, the blue box, off, and we will be using a full resolution image. I'm also just going to keep the ICC profile sRGB. Doesn't really matter for our demonstration over the web like this. So I'll click the OK button. Those are all set properly for us. And I'm just going to click into Color Efex Pro 4. Now, as the software launches, I want to kind of discuss with you the difference between what a filter is and a recipe. And basically, the biggest difference is that a filter is one of the individual tools that's built into Color Efex, and a recipe is usually a custom recipe that you've created, or it's one of the 20 recipes that come built into the software. But it's like creating your own custom preset, and you can do that in Color Efex with just one filter if you want to use a recipe with one filter, or you can add multiple filters and save what's called a stack of filters as your own preset that's going to create a particular look. Now, as the software launches, because we're launching from Photolab and we are using the TIFF file format, one of the new options within the Nik Collection 3 by DxO is that it is a non-destructive workflow when launching from Photoshop, Lightroom, and Photolab 3, right? And what this basically means is whatever we do in the software here, we can come back afterwards and re-edit the image or reprocess the photograph if we wanted to or needed to. And this is just telling me if I want to use that capability, I'm going to click the OK button. If I want to use that capability, I've got to click the checkbox that's down here in the lower right corner where it says Save and Edit Later. Now, for our purposes, I'm not going to worry too much about that right now. I'm just going to go ahead and maximize our Color Efex interface, and that's going to yield sort of the largest screen for our webinar presentation. And as I open the software, it opens into the En Vogue recipes. And I'll tell you what that is in a minute, but I'm going to click the back button that's in the upper left corner. All of these listings here, all custom imported favorites, recently used sample recipes in En Vogue, these are the recipes that are in my interface. And I have to say that specifically because if you don't have your own recipes in the software, you're just going to have the sample recipes. There's going to be 10 built in, and then the En Vogue recipes. These other ones are just ones that I've created, and that's why there's 46 of them. It's because I've got a bunch that are in my custom folder because I've created them myself, so they're custom. And we'll get into that. Before we really get into recipes though, let's just click on like the meat of the software, and that is the filter library in the upper left corner. So you can see we're in the recipes, it's highlighted in gold. If I click in the filter library, here is where you're going to be able to access the different filters you might want to use. And again, there are 55 of them. They're laid out in alphabetical order. And then they're also laid out in the filter library in slightly different ways. I think mine are, no, these are the defaults. But you can, no, maybe they're not the defaults. I actually need to potentially reset this. But these are different groupings of filters, and they are suggestions. So the suggested filters for nature photography, if you click on nature, it's going to reorganize the list for us. And these are some of the suggested filters that you might use for nature. And actually, several of the filters that we're going to talk about today are in this nature list. Brilliance and warmth, dark and light and center, detail extractor, and pro contrast are actually basically 4 of the 5 filters we're going to talk about today because they're very powerful, and they will allow us to control our images to the nth degree. In fact, let's actually click on one of these. So I'm going to click on the midnight filter because this is a highly stylistic filter, and I'm going to be able to show you a couple things about the filter list on the left-hand side. And I know some folks in the webinar are particularly experienced with Color Efex, but we've got a whole bunch of folks in here who are brand new. So if you already know this, it's just a little bit of recap for you. We will be getting into some, if you will, kind of new content as well, but or non-interface driven content, I should say. So the midnight filter, I've clicked on the filter. It has been applied to the preview here in Color Efex, and on the right side you can see the sliders that are specific to that filter, right? And right now you'll note that the color set is neutral, blur is at that, contrast, brightness, and color. These are the default settings for the midnight filter. One of the really nice options with every single filter built into Color Efex, so that you can kind of get a sense of the potential or some different looks with that filter, is if you move to the right side of the filter list, there's a little stack of prints. If you click on that little stack of prints, there's like, just a stack of 3 prints there. This is going to just shift over into some different settings for that particular filter. So now if I click on the violet setting, what you'll notice is that the adjustments for the midnight filter have changed. We're now, I'll look at color set violet as opposed to neutral, blur is down, contrast, and so on. If I click on sepia, you can see what's going on here. So this is a really nice way of kind of getting a sense of what the filter can do for you. And then, of course, if you like what's happening, but maybe it's not perfect, you can go over to the adjustment sliders and you can control those adjustments, right? And in fact, I'm going to show you kind of the basic anatomy of all of the filters in the next image or two. For now, I'm going to move back up into the left upper left corner. I'm going to click back. That's going to bring us back to our filter list. And let's go back into the recipes, because I want to kind of cover the things on the left side of the interface as we then jump over to the right side of the interface. So we're in the filter library. We're going to go back down into the recipes. And mind you, the difference is a filter is just an individual filter that's going to sort of show up in a stack on the right side. Right now, we just have the midnight filter. When we go and click on one of the recipes, what you're going to notice is the midnight filter is going to be replaced. And then there's also going to be several other filters, depending upon the preset that we click on, sorry, recipe that we click on, that's going to show up on the right side. So let's go over to the En Vogue recipes. I love these recipes. I actually developed these for Nik Software late last year, and they've been integrated into the plugins, which I'm super proud of. And it's actually a group of recipes that I was using, and then some new ones that I thought would fit into Color Efex that kind of gave some nice variation on the capabilities or on the groupings that were built into the software. Anyways, if I click on even on a cloudy day, watch what happens to the image and on the right side of the interface. Well, first of all, a warning is going to come up, because when I click on it, it's saying, okay, adding a recipe is going to replace anything you've done on the right side. It's just a warning. I leave these warnings on. You're going to see them pop up every once in a while on my computer. If you don't want them to come up every time, you just click the do not show again and then click yes. So I clicked on even on a cloudy day. You can see the image is very different looking now. And we have the old photo, cross-processing, levels and curves, and the sunlight filter applied. So before, we just had midnight. Now we click on the recipe, we've got this stack of 4 filters. In fact, if we go and click on a different one, like foliage bump, we're gonna get that warning every time, by the way. I leave it on so that for demonstration purposes, I can explain what's going on, because if I turn it off, I can't turn it back on afterwards. I have to reload the software. Anyways, lavender, this is a nice recipe. I actually love this recipe. We'll come back to this one later on because it does work well. And then Super Punch. So the recipe that's at the bottom of En Vogue, I'm gonna go ahead and click on it, click yes. This is gonna give us Bleach Bypass, contrast only, and pro contrast. So these are 3 contrast adjustment tools. I think that the effect overall is actually too strong. And this is one of the things that will happen when you click on a filter or on a recipe like this, is oftentimes it's not perfect, but it gives you a direction to go in. In fact, let's look at the before and after. So I'm going to click on the compare button just to show you where we came from to where we are now. As I press and hold compare, you can see the original capture. And then as I let go of the compare button, you're going to see the Super Punch preset applied. So I like what it's doing overall with this additional contrast. It's just too strong in my mind. And I also wish I had a little bit more color, right? So what we can do whenever you click on a recipe is go into the filter set and actually adjust the tools. So I'm going to click on Bleach Bypass, which is this top filter within the filter stack. And what's happening with this Bleach Bypass is it's actually it's desaturating the image a little bit, and then it's adding a lot of this local contrast. In fact, if we take a look at the before and after with just Bleach Bypass, if you just click on that little checkbox that's to the left of the label, you'll see the before and after. I can see what it's doing. I can say it's too strong, so I'm gonna dial back my local contrast, maybe to just 3 or 4%. And then if I want more color, oops, as my notes fall down. If I want more color, there's a few things that we can do. We can just click on the saturation slider and increase the saturation here, or we could actually add a new filter to our filter stack and increase the amount of saturation using maybe the Brilliance and Warmth filter or something else. But basically, when you click on a recipe, it will apply that particular set of filters for you. You can then go in and change them, and then you can add more or remove some. Like if you decide that you don't really like what the contrast only filter is doing, I think it's kind of nice here, but if you don't like it, you just click on the little X that's to the far right side of the filter, and that's going to get rid of that particular filter in your stack. If you decide that you don't want that, if you actually want the filter back that you just got rid of, you can use the sort of standard shortcut of Command Z, and that's going to step you one step back, and that's going to give you your filter back. In fact, one other little interface thing that we should talk about before I save this adjustment is the history state browser. And this is a really wonderful feature, and I'm throwing a whole lot of stuff at you, I know, with this interface, right? We're just learning about recipes and filters, but one of the really cool parts about the interface is if you click on the history state browser in the lower left corner here, everything that we've done to the image so far is basically saved into this interface right now. So what that means is if I decide, oh, you know what, I actually want to go back to, when we were clicking on the sepia preset for the midnight filter. Well, I just go and click on it in the list, and it's going to revert us back to that particular state. And the reason why I like to bring this up is it's a really nice way of being able to compare your image at different states if you want to do that, but also to kind of understand what you've done so far to these images, right? So Bleach Bypass, you can see I've made a saturation adjustment and a local contrast adjustment. I'm sure there are other uses for this that I can't even come up with right now. But that is kind of the basics of the filter library and the recipes, as well as the history state browser. So for the sake of time, let's just take one more quick look at the before and after. Press and hold the compare button. There's the before, there's the after. I actually want to add more color. So I'm going to click the add filter button on the right side of the interface. I'll show you that again. I did that kind of quickly. And I'm going to add brilliance and warmth. We're going to talk more about this filter later on. And I'm going to go ahead and warm the whole image just a bit. I've added a little bit of perceptual saturation. I love what that's doing for us. And now I'm happy with our adjustment. I think I actually got rid of one of our filters, but that's okay. I'm going to click the save button. And that's going to bring us back over into our host software. Right? In this case, we were launching from Photolab. And so what's going to happen in Photolab, and basically the exact same thing happens if you're a Lightroom user with the Nik collection, is that you're going to have your original image in your film strip, and then you're going to have your enhanced image saved into the same folder as, at least by default, the same folder as the original photograph. So you've got the original and then the enhanced. Cool, lovely. All right, so let's talk about customizing filters, because we've kind of gone in and started moving some sliders around, but I kind of want to give you an overall anatomy of what these filters do for you. So let's go to this next image. Our next photo, by the way, is shot by our lovely host, Lori Rubin. This is an image, I think, shot in 2016. I don't remember. Maybe she'd chime in later on. But anyways, beautiful photograph. I'm going to show you how to use the detail extractor filter, and we're going to talk about the anatomy of a filter. So we've got our image. By the way, before you go into the Nik collection, you would definitely utilize your raw processor to set up the image in a way that is, maybe close to how you want to output, or in a way that can help to set up for the kind of post-processing that you're going to do. And that's what I've done here. It's very simple. I just adjusted some white balance. I've got the DxO Smart Lighting on, which is this very wonderful, beautiful, simple thing that allows us to basically fix the image with a single click. And then I don't think I actually cropped. So there wasn't much done to this image because it was a really good exposure in the first place. But I do want to see what we can get out of the water. And the detail extractor filter is going to do that for us. So we're going to go to the lower right corner of our Photolab interface and click on the Nik collection button again. Click on to Color Efex Pro 4, and that's going to launch. And as that's launching, what Photolab does here is it takes the original raw data, it gets duplicated as a TIFF file, because that's what we've told it to do. And we're going to be working with that TIFF file, the separate file. So let's expand this out. There's a couple of shortcuts that might be nice to learn as well. If you just tap the F key on your keyboard, it'll go between this sort of floating window and a full screen view. That's just tapping F. Or you can, of course, use the expand or collapse buttons that are typical for for Mac or for PC users. All right, so I tend to navigate from the all filter library, and it's just purely because I'm used to using the software. Oftentimes it is really nice to kind of navigate the software using these other smaller sort of organized partitions of the library. And in fact, the favorites section here, I'm going to talk to you about how to create your own. And in fact, what you'll notice as I've clicked on the favorites in the filter library is that a lot of my favorite filters are now showing up, and each one of them has this little star that's to the left of the label, and it's highlighted in gold. And that's actually how you favorite a recipe or a filter. So if we go back to the all organization here, and I say, okay, I love Bleach Bypass. I do, I use it all the time. I might want to favorite that, and to favorite it, you just literally click on the little star that's to the left of the label. Any of those stars that are highlighted are going to be in that favorite section. And if you're launching from Photoshop, it's also going to show up in the Nik Selective Tool, which for Photoshop users, that's how you access the software, or one of the ways to access the software. All right, we're going to talk about the detail extractor filter. So in alphabetical order, we just come down to the detail extractor, click on it, and then right off the bat, when you click on a filter, its default adjustments affect the photograph, right? You can see it in the preview. And in fact, if I click on, let's say, the side-by-side preview in the upper leftish quadrant, and then I'm gonna hit the tab key on my keyboard, what you're gonna see here, it's relatively subtle, oops, sorry. On the left is the original image, and on the right is the enhanced image. But what I want you to pay attention to is the amount of texture and detail that you're gonna get, and it's derived from the image originally, but utilizing this detail extractor filter, which is a tool that's a proprietary algorithm built into the Nik collection, and it's a really amazing tool that we're gonna apply just into the water in this case. But you can see the difference, like right in here in these highlights, compared to in here in these areas, it just pokes out that detail just that much more. It's really quite wonderful. And it's great, oops, sorry, as I'm just clicking around. I actually want to, I'm gonna leave the filter list open, but I wanna be on the single image view. Sorry if I'm moving fast there. All right, so the detail extractor filter. Let's talk about these filters, and this is, we're gonna talk specifically about detail extractor, but I'm also going to kind of point out the basic anatomy of these filters. And the first thing is this little checkbox that's to the left of the label. We've talked about it already. It's actually how you can see a before and after of the application of that filter. With it off, you don't see the detail extractor. With it on, you see the detail extractor applied globally, right, affecting the entire photograph. If I wanted to close out the filter, I could do that by clicking the little X button there. It's going to get rid of that filter from our stack. And then there's a little sort of hamburger stack here with a triangle, right? It's a little options stack here. And what these do is basically apply or allow you to copy control points from one filter to another. And hopefully we can get to this, but this is, I'm not gonna say it's advanced, but it's not what we're here to talk about necessarily. I just wanted to show you where that is. If we have some time, I'll show you that. So with that, as we move into the filter itself, this particular filter has 3 sliders and a thing called effect radius. Other filters are gonna have 1 slider with maybe a drop-down menu like this one, or it might have 6 sliders or 8 or more, right? And basically the sliders itself allow you to control the specific filter that you're on. With detail extractor, if I slide this slider all the way to the right, I'm extracting a ton of detail. I don't think that this works very well for this picture. And in fact, I don't know of too many photos where the detail extractor bumped all the way up to its maximum of 85% is gonna be applicable or useful. But I will show you what's gonna happen if we bring it up to 60 or 70% and apply it specifically in one area, because that can actually be really quite nice. Anyways, contrast, it's precisely that. The contrast slider, if you increase the contrast, it's going to brighten up the brighter values and darken down the darker values, right, with a single slider. If you want to get back, or if you want to home any of the sliders back to their original default setting, you can just double click on it and it's going to home that slider. Saturation, It's basically the volume of the color. Again, we're not going to be able to talk about every single slider, but just to describe these three. If you increase the saturation, we're sort of turning the gain or the volume up on the amount of color that's showing up in the image. And then the effect radius is a pretty interesting capability here. So it's going to be set to normal by default, but what's happening in this tool is the detail extractor filter is trying to take a look at all of the brightest things in the image and darken them down with a natural amount of contrast. And it's also trying to take all of the darkest values in the image and it's trying to kind of brighten them up and add a little bit of contrast. And what these three radius adjustments allow you to do is change the way that effect is being applied, right? And that's probably the best way for me to explain it. I can go to fine, normal, and large, and there isn't a dramatic difference here. I think if we had a side-by-side, you'd be able to see a major difference between large and fine, like in specific details, but it's hard to actually get a sense via the webinar, so you've got to try it out yourself for sure. Underneath the specific sliders and tools of the filter, almost every adjustment or every filter that's in Color Efex is going to have the shadows and highlights sliders. And what these are going to allow you to do, I'm actually going to get this back to its default. Any filter that has a brightness or a contrast adjustment, for the most part, will have a shadow retaining slider and a highlight retention slider, or protection slider rather is the correct term. But if you take the shadow slider to the right, it's going to basically take anything that's a dark shadow and it's going to brighten them up, right? It's kind of like tone mapping. It's to save highlight or shadow detail. I actually don't see a difference in this case, but you'll find the shadows and highlight slider in a lot of the filters. Underneath those, you have a control points list, which we're going to open, and then you have the ability to affect or apply this filter specifically in an area or on an object, right? So the detail extractor filter and everything that we've done so far has been applied to the entire image. Those are global adjustments. But if we wanted to just apply the effect in maybe a small area or just a particular object, you can use plus and minus control points to do that. Plus control point is going to allow us to put this filter effect in on an object or in an area, and a minus control point is going to allow us to remove the effect from an object or on an area. So if we just want the detail extractor filter to be applied in the water, in the foreground, and maybe as it's sort of snaking back into the background, what we would do is click the plus control point button, and we just go and drop a plus control point on the object that we want it to be applied to. The beauty of this is the control point actually goes in and makes this beautiful photographic looking selection so that the application of the filter looks natural, as opposed to just literally cutting out these different areas of the water. This filter or the control point is actually trying to create a very photographic looking selection, which is going to yield you a very nice natural kind of effect. The plus control point puts the effect in. The minus control point would remove the effect. And if you ever want to see where these control points are affecting, you want to see the mask that the control points are making. We'll talk more about control points here. You click on the words control points on the right-hand side, and this opens up into an opacity slider. We'll get to that. And then also, there goes my notes again. We'll also, our control points, specifically control point 1 and control point 2 right now, right? And they're listed out for us. If I click on one within the control point list, you can see it's highlighted in gold, and then it is also active, right? So I know this control point in the foreground is active because I can adjust the slider. And the top slider, or the one that's parallel with the control point itself, is called the area of influence slider. And then the next one is the opacity. So the opacity is basically the strength of this control points application. So if you take the opacity down to 0, it's going to remove all of that filter effect. Whereas if you slide it all the way up to 100, it's going to apply whatever you're doing with the filter. I'm actually going to turn up the effect so we can actually see that. There you can see the difference from opacity at 0 to the opacity at 100. And it's too strong right now, but bear with me. So If you want to see the selection that this control point is making, you go over to the right side of the interface into your control points list, which just, once again, to access it, you have to click on the words control points. And if you click on the little box that's to the far right, you're going to see the selection that this control point is making, and therefore the application that this control point is putting on this with this filter. So control point number 1 is actually going, and anything you see that's white has the full application of this filter. Anything that's gray has some of the effect, and anything that's black has none of the effect. If I click on this filter or the control point and move it around, you can actually see instantly and sort of live what's happening with the control point selection. So if I wanted my control point to affect into these areas, I would actually just click on it and drag it in here. I actually prefer that it's really only adjusting the highlight areas of the water. But there's a few ways of controlling this. You can change the size of the area of influence, right? So that's going to basically help you to delineate what's being affected and what's not. And then you can place more control points. So if I go back to the right side of the interface, I don't want this control point to be affecting in the rocks here. I can just take a minus control point, place it in the rock, and that's going to remove the effect that that control point was applying to the rock there ever so slightly. I don't think you have to worry about being super specific most of the time. As long as this looks pretty good, and then you toggle the filter on and off to make sure it's doing what you want it to do, you'll be happy. Or at least I say that anyways, because the idea of these selections is that they look and apply the filter in a photographic manner. So what they're trying to do is apply the adjustment in a way that is going to be appealing to the human eye, and a way that is probably similar to what would happen to the actual light and color in the scene if you were adjusting it in camera somehow. So these control points do a really nice job to make it so you don't have to make any selections. You just put the plus points on the areas where you want the effect, the minus control points where you don't want it, and then you kind of can walk away. That's all you really got to worry about. And in fact, with our detail extractor, I'm going to increase the detail extraction. I'm going to increase the contrast. And now what we're going to get out of this is this much higher contrast water, but we also have a lot more detail than we had originally. So if we turn the detail extractor filter off, there's the before and there's the after. Cool, that's detail extractor. Let's click save, because we have like 4 more filters to talk about and several more things that I want to get into. Like launching the software from Photoshop. So let's go ahead and jump over into Photoshop, and we'll launch from there. And what we're going to do is create our own recipe using a couple filters. We're going to use Pro Contrast, the detail extractor filter, and then Brilliance and Warmth. So let's access the Nik collection. There's 2 ways of doing it here from Photoshop. You can go up to the filter drop-down menu, down to the Nik collection, and you can find any of the Nik collection. If you've got the Nik collection installed, they'll all show up here in alphabetical order. And you can also use what's called the Nik Selective Tool. So if down here in the lower left corner where this was sort of docked, this is a minimized Nik Selective Tool. It actually will look like this when you initially launch the software, probably. And this is the other way of accessing the Nik collection, at least with Photoshop. But there's a few different ways or states that you can have this in. It can be minimized with just the icons, completely minimized as it was a minute ago, or you can have it kind of maximized and open. Now, the Nik Selective Tool here allows us to have a couple other options. For example, all of these recipes are some of my favorite recipes. And then if I click into filters, these are several of my favorite filters, right? So inside of the Nik Selective Tool, I have access, like instant access to my favorite filters and favorite recipes. And this is a really wonderful way of working because it's faster. I can just click directly onto my Pro Contrast filter, and the software will launch directly into that Pro Contrast filter. If I were to just click on the Color Efex Pro interface, the button that's at the top of the section there, we'll do that on the next image actually. It's going to open the Color Efex software into whatever the last application of the filters were. So basically, oh, this actually just applied my Pro Contrast filter for me. I know why. I have a setting off. Sorry about that. I can talk to you about what that was too, but open color or Pro Contrast, the interface will launch, and it will launch directly into our Pro Contrast filter, which is another simple filter to use, and it's one that I use constantly for correcting contrast and color issues as well if I have a color problem. And we're gonna apply this globally, but don't forget, you could use this Pro Contrast filter selectively with control points, just like what we did with the detail extractor a minute ago. So another relatively straightforward filter, the correct color cast slider, if I slide that slider to the right, the software is gonna attempt to correct the color cast that might be happening in the image. If you've white balanced properly, you probably won't need to use this slider. Although I thought I had white balanced properly, and as I bring the correct color cast slider up into the right, it actually does a nice job to correct the little bit of color cast that I had in here because my white balance was incorrect. This actually looks like a more neutral color balance now after I brought my correct color cast slider up to 52% in this case. Now, correct contrast. So these two sliders, correct contrast and dynamic contrast, are designed to increase and control the amount of contrast in the image. And it does it in a way that's specific to this photograph. In fact, I'm going to just scroll down to the bottom. We haven't even looked at the loop or the histogram yet. It's another option in here. Every photo has its own set of information, right? And it's different for every photograph. And so therefore the histogram is going to look different for every single photograph for the most part. Somehow you might be able to get an identical or nearly identical histogram anyways. And what this filter does, the Pro Contrast, is it actually looks at the information in the image, looks at the histogram, and then as you increase this slider, it's trying to correct the overall contrast in the image based upon the actual image information in this specific photo. Dynamic contrast is doing the same thing, but it's correcting or adjusting the contrast in a different way than the correct contrast slider does. And I've over amplified these sliders right now, but let's look at the before and after using this little checkbox. Here's the before, it kind of looked a little bit flat, and here's the after with the corrected color and the corrected contrast. There's so much more depth to this image now. If we look at this side by side again, this is just the one filter. Again, I've over applied the filter at this point, but so that you can get a really dramatic sense of what's happening. On the left is the original, on the right is the enhanced. And the beauty of these this filter is that it's 3 sliders. It's very simple to use, and it's fast and easy and can be applied on almost any photograph that might be suffering from atmospheric haze, or maybe it's a little bit flat, and so on and so forth. All right, so I'm going to dial back my correct contrast and my dynamic contrast slider. We're going to click the Add Filter button, and then we're going to add that detail extractor filter again. And this time, when we add the detail extractor, I'm only going to add it to the clouds, because this is going to basically give us some cloud detail back without affecting the rest of the image for the most part. Right? And so it's as simple as that. I can leave it at the default settings if I want to. It works pretty well. If I needed to increase it, I could take the detail extractor slider up, maybe increase a little more contrast. Actually, I'm going to decrease contrast. There we go. And then I'm actually going to really bring the saturation down to 0 here. And that's just because I don't want to add color into the clouds in this case, because they should probably be relatively neutral. So I'm going to start to take that saturation slider down into the negative or at 0. And again, just to see a quick before and after, there's the before, there's the after. We've got some nice cloud detail now. And then we're just going to finish this image off with the Brilliance and Warmth filter. So we're going to add filter. So make sure to click the Add Filter. Ladies and gentlemen, if you don't click the Add Filter button and you go over to the filter list on the left side and you don't do anything, you just click on a filter, it's going to replace whatever the last filter was, right? So when you've got your filters the way you want them and you want to add a new filter to your stack, make sure you click the Add Filter button. Move over to the left side, click on Brilliance and Warmth. And I'm just going to increase the perceptual saturation in this image. In fact, to kind of explain these sliders, the saturation slider, pretty straightforward. Again, it's sort of like the gain or the volume of the saturation. You can increase or decrease that. Your warmth slider, relatively self-explanatory. If you slide it to the right, it warms the image. Slide it to the left, it cools the image. We just corrected the color with the Pro Contrast slider in terms of, its warmth and color cast. So I'm going to leave the warmth slider at 0. And I am going to increase the perceptual saturation. And I'm going to bring it all the way up to 60, just for the heck of it. We're not going to leave it here. It's too strong right now, although this can have some interesting applications for sure. For example, now that we've increased the perceptual saturation, you can actually see what I assume are the pine cones up at the top of the tree here. I'm not exactly sure, but it separates now, right? Whereas in the original, you really didn't see that difference. And obviously this is too strong, but it's a nice way of increasing this kind of color contrast throughout the whole image. And what the perceptual saturation adjustment is attempting to do, I'm going to double click on it, by the way. What the perceptual saturation slider is attempting to do is increase the amount of saturation as you slide that slider to the right, but it's trying to increase the not so saturated colors more so than it is increasing the more saturated colors, right? So long story short, it's a specific algorithm that's built into the software that is attempting to control color in a different way that doesn't exist in other tools. And why that's really important is because when you use this slider with your own kind of particular flair or trick to it, adjustments and so on, and combinations of different filters, you're able to create something that other photographers in other realms can't create, even if other folks are using the Brilliance and Warmth tool, right? And because there is a contingency of, a couple 100,000 photographers in the world that are using these tools. But the beauty of this stuff and being able to combine these different tools together is you can create your own effect, and these effects only exist within Color Efex Pro. Hypothetically, if you were an uber ultra Photoshop user, you could do some similar stuff, right? But the key to this software is that it's quick, it's easy once you get to know the software, and you can apply it wherever you want it. You can remove it from wherever you don't want it without spending much, if any, time. So let's say we love this combination: Pro Contrast, Detail Extractor, Brilliance, and Warmth. I like it. This is actually a set of filters that I use pretty commonly. So why don't we save it as our own custom recipe? It's pretty easy to do. All you have to do is click the save. Once you've set all of your adjustments and filters, you just have to click the Save Recipe button on the right side next to where it says Add Filter. When you click the Save Recipe button, it's going to ask you to name your recipe. So we're going to call this Landscape Filters. I'm going to call it Basic. It's not really basic, but it's a set of filters that I might use on a lot of different landscape images. So I'm going to say Landscape Filters Basic, click the OK button. Our recipes, the custom recipe section pops up, and then listed in alphabetical order, we're going to be able to find our new recipe that we just created. And of course, I've got all sorts of recipes in here that are really funky, but that's down here, Landscape Filters Basic. I'm going to click the OK button in the lower right corner. That's going to bring us back over into Photoshop. And let's open up the next image and just apply this recipe that we just created. I should have favorited it so it would just show up. I didn't do that. All right, so let's go to the next image. We're going to apply that same recipe to this photograph. So I'm going to click on Color Efex Pro 4. So instead of a particular filter or recipe, I'll just click on Color Efex Pro 4. The software is going to launch again, and I think the Pro Contrast filter is going to be the filter that shows up, because that was the first filter the last time we used the software, and that's why it launches that way. I'm going to go into my custom recipes, and I'm going to scroll down to my landscape filter recipe that we just created. We're going to click apply. We're going to say yes. We're going to see what happens. If we love the effect and we don't have to do anything from the before and the after, we're good. In fact, I really do like the effect that we're getting here, except I want to go into the detail extractor, and I want to see about getting a little bit more texture out of the water there. So I'm going to place a plus control point in our waterfall. I'm going to reduce my detail extractant, and I'm going to increase my contrast. Too much. I don't want too much contrast. And we're just going to bring the saturation back to 0. And then let's just take a look at the side-by-side. I'm gonna tap the Tab key on my keyboard after going into our side-by-side preview. You see on the left is the original and on the right is our preset, our recipe that we just created. And this is a pretty nice looking recipe that's gonna work for a lot of different kinds of photographs. It's straightforward. It's a set of filters that are corrective and not necessarily really super creative in terms of the transformation that takes place. But the benefit is I can apply this on all sorts of different pictures. The last thing that I'm going to do on this image, we're going to actually use that recipe, but I'm going to click the Add Filter button. We're going to use Dark and Lighten Center, which is another one of my favorite filters. This is, one of my last to talk about. I still want to show you cross-processing, but the Dark and Lighten Center filter basically is this sleight of eye trick that lightens the center of the image, but it darkens or burns down the border of the image, right? And so the beauty here, if I take the border luminosity and I slide that to the left, we're not going to leave it that dark, but I'm going to just show you what this is doing. And I take my center luminosity, slide it all the way to the right. Now we've basically relit our image, right? So there's the before, there's the after. And that's pulling our attention as the viewer directly into the middle, which in this case, that's, it's not a bad idea because we've got all these leading lines that push us right into our waterfall. And of course, we can make these adjustments so that they're much more subtle. In fact, I don't think we need so much perceptual saturation with the image. I think I kind of like the more subtle colors. This was shot last fall. This is outside of Ithaca. I've actually forgotten the specific waterfall and I shouldn't have. But anyways, I'm going to click the OK button, and that's applying our recipe that we just developed and saved, and then adding the Dark and Lighten Center filter to kind of polish it off a little bit more. I know we're coming up on time. I've got just one more filter that I really want to show you, and it's the cross-processing filter. And actually, as I do that, this is an image from the Great Salt Lake in Utah. And I want to just point out a couple things here. So first of all, there's still a dust spot. This is a panoramic image that's stitched together. And so in the upper right corner, there's a little bit of a problem because I was missing some pixels in the stitch. And then there's some dust spots. So I've got this layer here that's getting rid of that stuff. I just used the clone stamp tool to get rid of them. I did it in Photoshop because that's where I was going to show you how to use the software. The Color Efex software, but I wanted to point that out ahead of time, figuring that people might ask what that layer number 1 is. And I should also point out that if I'm going to spot an image like that, and I add a whole lot of contrast, let's say I convert this image to black and white and I make it a very high contrast black and white, there's a chance that I'm going to have to re-spot the image, because if I don't spot it perfectly, I'm going to zoom in and just show you one of these little dust spots. So here's one of the dust spots that was on my sensor when we shot that. And then here's my after. If I don't adjust those pixels perfectly ahead of time, it's likely that I'm going to have to redo it afterwards. So I guess what I'm getting at is, be ready to do it twice, or make all of your adjustments and then spot the image afterwards. But it's entirely up to how you want to work. Yeah. All right, so as this launches, we're going to click on the cross-processing filter. It's the 5th filter that I wanted to show you today, and it's kind of more creative, if you will. I guess I don't have a better term to say that in, because I think of the filters as being corrective filters that are designed to kind of fix a problem and help you with contrast or a color grade problem or color white balance issue or something. The other filters are more sort of like a creative sense, and they're designed to transform the image into something different from what it was or however it was captured. The cross-processing filter is actually emulating a process that lots of photographers still use. This was very popular in the 80s, and that is cross-processing, and that's shooting one kind of film and then using another kind of film's chemistry to process it. So it's cross-processing, right? And long story short, I use this one all of the time. I use basically 3 of the different cross-processing settings, and that is, if I click on my method, I usually use L02, L03, and then if I want to, sometimes I'll use in the E6 C41, C01. Now, this is purely my opinion. right? The rest of the tools that I showed you, those are corrective tools. They're great. You'll figure out how you use them all the time, or if you use them at all. This one is just, I like it. It's creative. It's a really nice tool to use. And I actually am going to apply it twice. I'm going to use the E6 to C41, C01, this setting. And we're just going to apply it to the foreground using some plus control points. And then what we're going to do is apply it another time using control points, but a different application in the top part of the photograph. What I'm doing right now is I'm duplicating control points, and I'm just kind of running it across the bottom of the image. The way that I was duplicating the control point is I hold the Option key down on a Mac, or Alt if I'm on a PC, click on the control point that I want to duplicate. So Option, click and drag, and that's going to make me a duplicate control point. And so I was doing that because I kind of want to just cover these things in the foreground. And if I make one giant control point that encompasses the whole foreground, it's highly likely that that point is going to also affect up into here. And I only want this cross-processing tool to be applied basically in the bottom of the image and not in the middle or the top of the image. So that's why I'm kind of using the control points this way. So I've got cross-processing applied that way. We're going to click Add Filter. I'm going to add just one more, and then I want to save some time for questions, so I'm just going to do this really quickly. We're going to use the L02. And I'll tell you, so I made this photograph, or panoramic computational photo image, while on vacation with my wife and my family. And what I ended up doing, I'm going to click the OK button and apply that. What I ended up doing is making a big print of this for my wife, because it's about 90 megapixels in the full resolution form. And before I made her the print, I did a recording of her cat Jeep, and I took the sound wave and I overlaid the sound wave into the pixels. So the mountain actually has these really strange, unnatural sort of juts up and down that matches the cat meowing, because she was sad that she left the cat and was mentioning that over and over again at certain points in the trip because she missed her cat. And anyways, you know, because there's that relationship with the trip and the cat, I thought it was nice, and she's now put it up in her office. It's kind of an interesting application of sound, our experience in the image all at once. Anyways, Lori, I think that that's all I've got for our time. We've got a couple minutes for questions if there are any questions that have come in.
Okay, so we do have a lot of questions.
Cool.
What I'd recommend is I'm going to give Dan some to answer that I think are more global, requests that people have been asking. If you have anything specific in your survey at the end of the presentation, you can go ahead and ask it there, and we'll follow up with you. So yeah, for now, Dan, let's start with this. Can you explain what local contrast versus regular contrast? What's the difference?
Sure. So that's pertaining to the Bleach Bypass filter. Let's open up an image, and then I got to find my layers. Let's delete this and open up into Color Efex. I've minimized everything, so of course it's going to take me a second. But filters, Bleach Bypass. So there are actually, the local contrast slider is in a couple of the filters in Color Efex. You'll actually find this same slider inside of Sharpener Pro 3 as well. And the initial idea of Bleach Bypass is actually another film processing tool. In the color chemistry process, there's bleaching that occurs, and if you skip that, this is what can happen. The initial, or the look, will look like this. If we turn these settings down, we can get a little bit more of a subtle adjustment. But to talk about the local contrast in the contrast slider, the standard contrast slider is precisely that. It just looks at the image and it lightens the highlight areas, the brighter areas, darkens the darker areas. Local contrast it's kind of like a sharpening effect, in so much as when the Bleach Bypass filter is opened, the software assesses the image and it finds the edges of everything. And basically the software knows, what an object is. It doesn't know that this is a rock and this is a tree and so on, but it recognizes that there's a major color and tone difference between the edge of the tree and then where the rocks begin. So it can recognize where those objects begin and end. And so local contrast basically goes into those areas and it adjusts the little lines and textures inside of those little object areas in a different way. It adds contrast to them than the standard contrast slider does. And that's why you get sort of like this sharpening effect. If I zoom in, this is zoomed into 100%, and we look at the before and after. So I've reduced the contrast as low as it'll go, and I increased the local contrast as much, well, a bunch. And you can see the before and the after. And it's increasing, basically like looking at this area separately from this area, separately from this face, separately from the waterfall, and it allows us to basically increase the localized contrast.
Cool.
Hopefully
Dan, how about, yes. What's the difference between perceptual saturation and regular saturation?
Oh, sure. Same kind of idea, right? So the regular saturation slider is gain, right? It's the amount of the saturation. If you bring it to the right, it's going to bump up the amount of color. It doesn't necessarily shift those colors. It just looks at this green yellow and it looks at this orange and it says, let's turn it up, right? Whereas the perceptual saturation slider does that, but it actually looks for colors that are, it looks for warm colors, increases the saturation in the warm way, right? Sort of towards that warm area in the color wheel. And then in the perceptual saturation in the cool areas, it actually will take these blue-greens and it'll push it a little bit more blue-green. And it also attempts to look at the things that are not as saturated and increase the saturation more so in those areas that are less saturated compared to the areas that are more saturated. Like these areas here, this part of the tree has a lot of saturation in it initially. And so as the perceptual saturation adjustment is made, it also gets some of that. But what you'll notice is that these areas that were almost neutral, right? So there's these little details in the rocks here that in the initial image, you couldn't really tell a difference between whether it was warm or if it was cool. As you adjust that perceptual saturation, that becomes much more obvious and blatant. So now we have this really beautiful color contrast between these areas that were a little bit warm before and a little bit cool before.
That's great. Dan, can you repeat the 5 favorite filters that you like to use for landscapes?
Yes. So there are the 4 sort of corrective ones, and that would be the detail extractor, pro contrast, brilliance and warmth, and then dark and light and center. And then I threw in the cross-processing one as a, one of my favorites that's more of a creative image editor as opposed to corrective. I also like the film effects vintage and film effects faded as well for lots of landscape stuff. But we could talk for hours about the individual filters, and I have maybe 30 of them are my favorite, really, which is not a good way to have a favorite of anything.
By the way, I put a link to the list of all the filters in Color Efex Pro in the chat box, so you'll be able to click on that, and I'll take you to our user guide with nice details of each of the 55 filters in there.
Yeah, and that actually has all of the write-ups of the individual sliders. So it will give you a more concise description of what perceptual saturation is doing. People are going to go automatically and look at that one now. And you can see it, as you make the adjustment, just watch what the slider is doing to the image. So cool.
Okay. All right, we're at the top of the hour. One quick question. Not sure if you showed this already, but changing the opacity setting.
I didn't. Yes, I do need to show that.
Thanks.
Good. Thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna increase this perceptual saturation and the regular saturation just to make this more obvious. We're gonna click the Add Filter button, and I'm gonna add my 31st favorite filter, the infrared film filter. So this filter tries to emulate what would happen if you shot this scene with infrared film. And there's a couple different kinds of infrared film and how they would respond. And so there's some color renditions, which are real funky and cool. And then there's this number 2, which is the one that I gravitate towards because I like the glowing effect that occurs. But the thing is oftentimes I like the glowing effect, but I don't want it to turn black and white, and I don't want to lose all of my detail, right? So I'm gonna just go in and kind of adjust this the way I think it should be. This looks much better. There's a kind of interesting blur or glow to it now. But I do this with color images, which is why I left Brilliance and Warmth where it is. If you go into the control points area, the control points list, every single filter has this opacity slider. And the opacity slider is basically the strength of the application of this filter. At 100%, you see the entire effect. At 0%, you see none of it. And so I like to use infrared film at like 6 or 15 or around, very low opacity. And what that's going to do for me, especially if I've increased the amount of saturation with the brilliance and warmth, what that's going to do for me is it's going to create this kind of glowing overall effect. So here's the before, and there's the after while using the opacity slider. And because I've oversaturated the image, I can actually increase my infrared film setting here a little bit more, still get a natural looking effect. And if we don't like it in any area, like in the sky, it creates too much kind of like flaring effect, we can go and remove it with our minus control points.
Okay, with that being said, let's go ahead and wrap this up. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I hope you will join us on another webinar. And Dan, I'll let you close out.
Yeah, thank you, Lori. I had a lot of fun. I love doing these. I don't know, like I always have more energy at the end of the webinar than I did at the beginning because I get so hyped about talking about this stuff. So hopefully my pace didn't change too much, but we were able to talk about those 5 favorite filters, all of this stuff that you see on screen now. Thanks again, ladies and gentlemen.